So greetings from here in Pennsylvania once again. And it's been a while since we've done an episode in our Bigfoot series, but that's going to change today. I'm going to tell a couple of different stories today. I have that one book with me called Bigfoot in Pennsylvania. I'll show it to you a little bit later, but it's actually a collection of newspaper articles from the mid-1800s up to the early 1900s. So I like those stories. They're the older ones. And one thing interesting about them is they never actually used the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch in those newspaper articles because those terms weren't really being used back then. More often than not, they use the term, wild man or hairy man to describe what people are seeing. And I kind of want to focus on that in this video a bit. I'm going to read you several accounts in this video. They're all kind of local to the area that I'm in. I'm here in Lebanon County, Swatara State Park. But none of the stories is kind of big enough to do its own video on. And I'm also going to reference some other stories I've told in the past that always kind of refer to a wild man. So perhaps there's more to that, Because I mentioned this before, when you talk about Bigfoot, you kind of have to keep an open mind. At least I try to. Because I think my first video in this series, I kind of told you what I believe, how I kind of fit into that category where I'm skeptical, but I want to believe. Talk about trying to keep an open mind about these things. But keeping an open mind isn't just about being open about the existence of Bigfoot and other creatures like that. It's also keeping an open mind that a lot of these stories, there's a more plausible explanation for what's happening. Not everything that people are encountering is Bigfoot. There is a balance to all these things. Sometimes we see what we want to see sometimes. We're so convinced that something exists. Or sometimes it goes the opposite way too. Even when we come across overwhelming evidence that something does exist, we still don't believe because we're convinced that it doesn't exist. So, yeah, you gotta be careful about those things. So anyway, like I said a little bit, I'll show you the book and we'll read a few of those stories about what people encountered. And then we'll talk about the whole wild man or hairy man concept. Perhaps that is exactly what people are seeing out here in the woods. Not just back then, but maybe today. Some crazy wild man just living out in the woods. Alright, so here is that book, Bigfoot in Pennsylvania by Timothy Renner. Like I said, it's basically a collection of newspaper articles from about the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. So like I said, we're going to read just a few stories from here. Maybe at this spot as we go further along down the trail here. But one is from this area. Like I said, we're here in Swatara State Park, and just over that way is the Swatara Gap. So here's a story from this area. Like it's just a shorter story, not necessarily worth its own video. It deals with the whole wild man thing. The Berks County wild man, which is in other stories in this book, who haunts the mountains in the neighborhood of Swatara Gap, has been seen again. He is said to be over 7 feet high, with a face and body covered with hair, walks on his hands and feet like a beast, and jumps 10 feet at a time with apparent ease. So you can think what you may of that story, but I think it's referring to it talks about the Berks County wild man has appeared again, because there's other stories about him. We did a video down the Swatara Creek, down, was it Bidnagel's church, about that wild man that was seen, bathing in the Swatara Creek. There's been other wild man sightings in this area that we've read about, including this one. I think we did the one, I just did that story about the hairy man that was found at the Sand Springs Trail north of, was that Charlottesville, near the Hamburg area? And this is in that area here, this story. So this is from Hamburg in 1873, the town of Hamburg, which is farther that way in northern Berks County. A wild man is said to have been seen on the Blue Mountain in Upper Bern Township last week by a man who drove his cattle on the mountain. He says that the man is in nude condition and that his entire body is covered with hair about 3 inches in length. That's kind of that common thing, that they're not wearing anything and they're very hairy. Where was I? After the man had driven his cattle to the desired place, he went home and got some neighbors to go along up the mountain to catch the critter. But he had disappeared, and their search was unsuccessful. Some think that the whole thing is a hoax, while others think otherwise. But that's kind of interesting, even in that last story, which dated to 1873. Even back then, people were considering such things to be possibly a hoax, that someone's making a story up. So here's another one from the area. This is from Reading, around that same time period, maybe a little bit later. Special Detective John Smith of the Mount Penn Gravity Railroad area. And a posse of citizens have been unsuccessfully searching Mount Penn for a wild man who created considerable excitement last fall and who was seen again Thursday night. It is believed that he is an escaped lunatic. Yeah, that comes into this story too. He's an escaped lunatic from some asylum and that he has lived on the mountain all winter, sleeping in the basement of one of the abandoned homes up there on the mountain during the cold months. When approached, the wild man gives a yell, butts his head against a tree with his head, and then his clothing being in tatters too. So some crazy, it's not just a wild hairy man, but a crazy hairy wild man. But that story reminds me of the one we did near my hometown of Womelsdorf, or in the Warrensville area, where there was in the woods down there, people thought there was some wild creature, Bigfoot type creature living up there, because they would go into the area and there'd be something would scream at them and throw rocks at them and yell at them. And you remember what it turned out to be? It turned out to be a woman that was living up there on the mountain. Probably some homeless woman. She acted real crazy. Probably a lunatic as well. In some ways, they think she was escaped from the local state hospital there. So there's a common theme in these stories as well. Let me read you one more. This is from up in Schuylkill County, not too far from, it says Frog Hollow in here. If you remember Frog Hollow, that's where I did that video recently where that one house I liked and they tore it down and stuff. If you follow my videos. But anyway, so that kind of hit home there too, that area. While searching for his lost cow on the mountain near Frog Hollow, Joseph Anderson was yesterday given an unpleasant surprise by an unclothed wild man about 6 foot in height, emerging from behind a tree. Anderson became greatly unnerved, started on a wild run homeward. The man, however, however, unmindful of his presence, continued on his wild tramp through the street. Because they're out in the woods, so that's why it says street there, but it's a newspaper article. It is thought to be an escaped lunatic from the asylum, as he was seen 2 weeks ago near Ringtown. So as you can see, there is a pretty common thread in those older stories. Like every story I read you there was from the 1800s about these encounters being like a wild man or a hairy man or someone escaped from an insane asylum, which could be true, or is that just their explanation for what they're seeing? Like this is pre, like, you know, Bigfoot Sasquatch craze time when everybody was talking about it. They didn't use those terms back then. So one way to look at it is that they were seeing Bigfoot creatures, but that was their explanation for what they were. Like I said, the other explanation is that is exactly what those were, is some crazy, you know, someone who's escaped from a mental, bug flies in my ear, someone who's escaped from a mental institution and just living wild, carefree out in the woods. But it raises the question, what exactly were those people seeing back then? You know, because a lot of the stories are pretty clear. You know, these people were covered in hair. You know, mentioning 3-inch long hair on their bodies, which is not normal for folks. I mean, you can grow a long beard, long, you know, hair on your head and stuff, but to have your whole body covered with hair that's 3 inches long, you know, that's not exactly normal. But I have come across other stories, non-Bigfoot related, things I've read and things that people have told me about people who were living in harsh conditions, you know, living in the elements, you know, in the cold, without clothing and stuff, either willingly or one was a woman was a prisoner somewhere, and she was kind of put in this dungeon area that had no heat or anything, and her body grew hair. I mean, not just on her head and stuff, but she grew like a long covering of hair over her whole body in response to living that way. So I'm not saying that that's true, it's just something I read or was told me at one point. I've heard similar stories about that too. So is that what's happening to these people? Are they actual escaped wild people? And because of how they're living and their body's growing this longer hair? I don't know. As of now, I haven't looked into that more. That's something to consider, I guess. Or on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, were they indeed seeing, you know, the creature that we call Bigfoot today, and they're just trying to rationalize it in their own way by describing it as a hairy man, hairy wild man. But that book is full of references, like I said, to those newspaper articles, and so many of them refer to a wild man. Hey, yeah, back to that one story I told you about the Bigfoot that was bathing in the Swatara Creek. What if that was just a wild, a man living like a homeless guy? I think he mentions a cave in that video. Maybe he was hanging out in that cave. It mentions there were chickens missing from the local farms. Maybe it was just a local homeless dude living wild, living in the cave and eating the neighbor's chickens. And I think I remember that story that they shot at the creature. What if it was just a dude that they were shooting at in the water? And not too far from here, back to the east, I did a video, like I said, on the Sand Springs Trail. We went up to Sand Springs, and supposedly there was a Bigfoot sighting up there in the early 1900s, which they referred to as a wild man again. They went up to that spring, and they looked up, and there's this big, wild, like hairy-looking man creature. What if it wasn't Bigfoot? What if it actually just was exactly that? Sometimes your mind, when you're out in the woods like that, and you see something, suddenly your mind plays tricks on you. Something to consider too. But just remember too, I'm not taking sides in this video. That's kind of my goal throughout this whole series on Bigfoot, was not to take a side. So I'm not saying that what these people were seeing wasn't Bigfoot. I'm not saying it is either, but if I'm honest, I kind of lean towards it not. That idea of these just being, like some of the articles mentioned, maybe someone who's escaped from an asylum and is just living wild out in the woods. Not wearing anything, hairy, all that kind of stuff. It's a distinct possibility. And another thing to consider is that back then people were a lot more superstitious about stuff. About there being like mythical or mystical creatures out in the woods, things like that. So if they saw something unsettling or disturbing, their mind automatically went to it being something that they read from folklore, something that their local tradition talks about. Almost, and then it kind of takes on its, your imagination kind of runs with that, and as the story gets retold and retold, by the time it gets to the newspaper article, it's something more than what it was sometimes. That still happens today with folks. Like I said, if you're convinced that Bigfoot exists, I think I talked about this earlier in the video, but it's the same. If you're convinced and you see something on the woods, you might convince yourself it is. But like I said earlier, it goes the other way around too. If you actually did see a Bigfoot creature in the woods, if you're a non-believer, you might convince yourself that it wasn't that. Our beliefs or bias tends to affect what we see a lot of times. And that brings us to modern times then. Is the same thing happening today with some of the Bigfoot sightings that people are seeing? Is it just someone living out in the woods? It may not be a lunatic or someone who used to be in an asylum. There's a lot of people just, I don't know. There's a lot of homeless people these days. Who knows? Just someone out in the woods in a rough state, and people see something and their mind kind of runs with it. Is that what's happening today even? I'm just raising the question or the possibility of that. Because to be honest, if I'm walking down this path, let me turn around. If I saw some large human-like figure just run across the trail, and that humanoid figure was very hairy because he was unshaven and maybe his hair was growing long, maybe just had a lot of body hair, that would startle me. What would my mind, if only I saw it for a few seconds too, what would my mind think it was? It just comes right across the trail here. And a lot of these modern stories occur like at night too, I've noticed. They see something like that run across in front of them. Of course, the lighting is even worse then, obviously, because it's at night. So, what you're seeing and what you think you're seeing can be very different things sometimes. I'm just saying it's a possibility. Anyway, as always, you can let me know what you think in the comments. I know people who watch these videos have very strong opinions either way. Some of you are convinced that Bigfoot doesn't exist, and some of you are. I get very varying comments on these videos. But anyway, you can let me know what you think of the concept that maybe the vast majority of these Bigfoot sightings now and then are just that wild man concept. And that's really all it is. Alright, well, it's starting to rain on me here. I was actually thinking about going somewhere else today, but then I changed my mind because of the rain, and I guess that was a good thing. it was going to be a longer trip down to Philly area. Wasn't supposed to rain till this afternoon, but it's coming a bit early. Because like I said, I wasn't planning on filming a Bigfoot video today. Planning on going down to, like I said, the Philly area, film some other things, but I'm glad I changed my mind. Like I said, I haven't done a Bigfoot video in a while. And I'm going to continue to do these. I know some of you like them and some of you don't. And I'm still learning myself. I love coming across new stories. I enjoy having my beliefs challenged too, as well. That's beautiful. Let me show you. That's a beautiful sight. Look at the stream down there. Wouldn't it be cool to see just upstream there some big hairy figure like splashing around the water, and maybe washing itself off, like some of the stories say. But anyway. Alright, so there you go. What is this wild, hairy, crazy man that people have been encountering in the woods here in Pennsylvania and all over the country and the world for centuries? What is it? Is it just that? A wild, crazy, hairy man or woman living out here in the woods? Or is it indeed, or perhaps something else? Some Bigfoot or Sasquatch type creature that has yet to be discovered by science. Anyway, you let me know what you think down in the comments, as always. As always, be kind to other people, be respectful. Occasionally you guys get a little aggressive with each other, to say the least. But anyway, and if you have another story, Bigfoot story you'd like me to talk about or do a video on, you can let me know about in the comments down below as well. Anyway folks, I gotta get back to the Jeep. The weather's turning darker, so I gotta get going. As always, thanks for coming along, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one.